But what I was referring to was actually one of my first encounters with what I call politically correct medicine.
Oh, okay.
And it was about something going on at San Francisco General Hospital.
How did you come in contact with it?
I found out about it because a colleague of mine had been in a meeting sponsored by the American Psychiatric Association, and there they were discussing something called multicultural treatment. And San Francisco General Hospital was a place in which this was very avidly endorsed. And as the more he told me about it, the more I was stunned. Basically, what was going on there and what's still going on there is a division of the inpatient unit. The psychiatric inpatient units in San Francisco General are divided up by race. Essentially, it's identity politics moving into psychiatry. There's a black unit. It's called the Black Focus Unit. There's a unit for HIV-positive patients, one for Asians, Hispanics, and women. None for white men, Brian,
Well, what do you think of this?
I think that it's perverse. I think that when it started out in the 70s, it started out with two specialty units, one for Asians and one for Hispanics. And at that time, it made perfect sense because there were a lot of unacculturated immigrants. They didn't speak the language. It made the most sense to have a unit that had doctors and nurses who spoke the language and other patients who also understood the customs and, again, spoke the language to be together, and that would enhance treatment. And that made perfect sense. But when special units for gay patients, for gay schizophrenics, for black schizophrenics, for example, started to be formed, I thought that the clinical imperative was giving way to basically victim politics. And in fact, I did interview some of the folks involved with the San Francisco project, and the rationale for it, it didn't seem to me that it was in the best interest of patients at all. I mean, the idea behind the Black Focus Unit, for example, was that in order for patients to readjust, in order to go back out in the community and live more productively, they had to really come to terms with the fact that they were victims of racism. And much of the staff training focused on that. Many of the groups for patients focused on that. It turned out, though, after a few years, there was so much rancor and so much almost paranoia among the staff about race politics that it became an inhospitable environment for white trainees. So now it's one of the few units at San Francisco General, which is a major teaching hospital at University of San Francisco Medical School, that doesn't have any trainees because the environment, the milieu just got too touchy. That's not healthy for patients. And ironically now, again, in this age of managed care and efforts to keep costs down, patients they come in very sick. Some of them are committed. I mean, they're literally forced against their will because they're so psychotic they really don't even know are dangerous to themselves or others. They have to be essentially committed, and they're there for such a short period of time that there's really only enough time to stabilize them on medication. So in a sense it becomes moot, I think, at this point. But the philosophy behind it that basically we have to treat patients as members of victim groups rather than as individuals who are suffering is a very destructive trend to me, and in fact one that's becoming quite popular in the counseling profession. And that's where multicultural counseling, I didn't make that term up, is taking off. It's endorsed by the American Counseling Association. I went to their meeting last year, and that was in fact, that was the theme of the meeting, diversity and multicultural counseling, and it's very, very pernicious. There are three basic tenets to multicultural counseling, and I must say this is not done with people who are wildly psychotic. It's done with people who have problems with living, difficulty adjusting, minor depression or anxiety. But the three tenets of multicultural therapy are, first, that the therapist, the counselor, assumes that the most important aspect of a patient's psychological landscape is his or her membership in an oppressed group. Assumes that. The second is that whatever distress this patient is suffering from is inevitably due to his or her bumping up against racism, sexism, or some sort of oppressive force. And thirdly, that for the patient to get better, he or she will have to engage in some sort of social activism, which only makes sense, of course, if you believe that it's the environment that's largely responsible for your psychic distress. Then that's got to be the thing that you seek to change. Now, when you think about it, this is the antithesis of therapy. Therapy should be about self-observation. It should be about taking responsibility for choices. It really is often, good psychotherapy is about learning how an individual unwittingly sabotages himself. You have a student who thinks he wants to go to medical school, and you have to wonder then why did he miss his MCAT exam, and why is he fail organic chemistry, and that sort of thing. And that's a very rich source of neuroses, as we say, to mine. But it's not about blaming. It's not about externalizing. It's about looking inside, and you can't do that if you're focusing on oppressive forces. Yes, what I talk about in my book is really an effort to, well, the book is really an expose of what I call political correctness in medicine, the idea that disease and even behavioral dysfunction are primarily caused by social injustice, and that doctors and especially public health professionals should take on social justice as a mission. I reject that, but that's this trend I call political correctness, and I see it in many venues. I don't see it in my clinic. In fact, I described to some of the counselors there the multicultural therapy that I saw going on at another DC clinic that I did work in, and they thought it was bizarre. And
where's that?
Oh, that was with the DC Superior Court. It's since been it's since been shut down and started up again, and I think a more healthy and clinically productive way.
What was going on there, and what did you do there that's different than where you are with this methadone clinic?
At this clinic I worked in, as I said, it was part of the DC Superior Court, so our patients were court ordered. In fact, the context was something called a drug court. I'll just explain that to you very briefly. Drug court, they're not very popular. There are about 500 of them across the country. They started in 1989, and the idea is to divert nonviolent addict offenders into treatment, to try to distinguish between the criminal addict and the addicted criminal, and take the person who but for a habit wouldn't have committed a minor crime, and not incarcerate them, but send them to treatment. And I'm all in favor of that. In fact, I know from my own experience and from a lot of research I've done that kind of coerced treatment works especially well because it ensures retention in treatment programs, and we know that's the best predictor of outcome. Well, that said, DC had a drug court, and but the clinic, which I went to work in '95, was inhabited by counselors who did endorse this multicultural approach, and that's how I first became aware of it. And so we had our patients, almost exclusively black men in their 20s and 30s. The majority of them were functionally literate. Few of them had high school diplomas, let alone GEDs. They didn't have much experience in the legitimate workforce, and we could have done so much for them. As I said, they were our captives. We had them 5 hours a day for a minimum of 9 months. We could have set them up with apprenticeships and GED courses, but instead, they spent hours in groups, being counselor-led groups, in which they were inculcated in their victimhood. They were talking about racism and how you oppressed black men. One day I came in and they were doing art therapy, coloring in stencils of the African continent in the spirit of ethnic self-pride. And the patients themselves, if this isn't a tragedy, the patients themselves thought this was a terrible waste of their time.
Who's teaching them that? White or blacks?
Both.
And the psychiatrists there are...
No psychiatrists.
No psychiatrists.
Thank goodness this hasn't seeped too far into psychiatry. Psychiatrists and psychologists are still among the most sophisticated mental health professionals. You know, if you imagine sort of a pyramid like this, in terms of number and training, psychiatrists at the very top, psychologists close up there, then the social workers, another band, and then at the bottom, counselors, who some of them are excellent. I've worked with some of the most wonderful counselors. A lot of them have had the advantage, of course, of being addicts themselves, so they have enormous experience in having had that, lived through it and recovered, and they've also got some technical training, and some of them have been the most wonderful, but others, and those were the ones I worked with in '95, I can't say that they were the most wonderful, and you learn this in schools of counseling. If you look at
give us an example where you learn this.
Oh, you can learn it at the University of Connecticut at Bridgeport. You can learn it at the University of Oregon. Any school that has a department in counseling that gives graduate degrees in counseling has offers either courses or a concentration in multicultural therapy.
Well, how did you...
I became interested in a report that got a lot of media coverage of the notion that African Americans were more likely to suffer from high blood pressure, which is true, they are about twice as likely, but that the reason for this, as discovered by a professor at Harvard School of Public Health and published in the American Journal of Public Health, was because they suffered the stress of being discriminated against.
Is Alfred Poussin?
No, but he is there. He's a psychiatrist there. He is.
Yeah. And does he have the same theory that racism causes hypertension?
He might have that theory. I know that he is in favor of considering racism a mental illness. He'd written a book about that recently, and he had an op-ed, I remember, in the New York Times right after Buford Furrow, that white, I believe he may have had white supremacist ties in L.A. a few summers ago, shot some in a synagogue and then killed an Asian man, I believe, and that prompted him to write the op-ed in the Times that racism should be considered a mental illness. And in fact, that was brought before the American Psychiatric Association once, I believe in the 70s, and I believe he was part of the effort to have the APA designated as such and put it in the DSM, at that time maybe DSM-1, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the Handbook of Diagnoses. They rejected that.
Is there any proof that you know of that on this question about racism that causes physical reaction on the part of anybody that's not of the white race?
Sure. Well, there's no question in my mind that any kind of stressful situation can cause a physiological response. I mean, we've known that for ages. I mean, stress causes changes in can cause actually changes in the immune system, usually prolonged stress, but certainly can lead to blood pressure elevation, hormonal changes. There's nothing new about that. But when one looked at her data, the data of the professor at Harvard who was concluded that the stress of discrimination was responsible for this disparity in high blood pressure. When you look at the data, they didn't hold up. In a nutshell, she sought to measure discrimination, which is hard to do, admittedly. That's a very hard thing to do. Her scale was 0. In other words, they asked they had a good sample size, about 4,000 patients, and asked them, and these were patients, fairly young patients who were going to a Kaiser clinic, I think, in California somewhere, asked them, have you ever been discriminated against in your life? So 0 was one designation, 1 or 2 times, and 3 or more. Those were the 3 categories. Let's just stipulate that the responses were meaningful. But what they found, she and her colleague, were that you didn't see the kind of direct relationship, the kind of positive relationship you would expect, which is to say that the level of blood pressure would track with the reports of discrimination, so that those who said they were not discriminated against would have the least blood pressure, lower blood pressure readings, and so on. You didn't find it at all. I think in black men you found a negative correlation. In other words, those reporting no discrimination had the highest readings. Among women, there was something called a U-shaped curve, where those who said they had no discrimination had the highest blood pressure. Those who said they had 3 or more had the highest, but those with 1 or 2 had an intermediate. Anyway, it was all over the map. And what most researchers would conclude from that kind of distribution of data was that, in fact, there is no correlation. But instead, what these researchers invoked was something called internalized oppression. The idea being that the folks who claim to have no experiences of discrimination really did, but that either they didn't register it consciously as discrimination because they had such a low self-regard that they felt this was just acceptable behavior. This is the way we should be treated in society, hence internalized oppression. Didn't even register as an aberrant event. Or perhaps they found it too painful to report. These were the explanations, but that's not a falsifiable explanation. In other words, it can be evoked to explain anything. So it's not really scientifically rigorous.
Define some of the terms you write about. What's an endocrinologist?
Well, that is a term that I made up. Actually, a patient of mine made it up. He said he was going to the endocrinologist, but he garbled it in such a way it was a great neologism, and I thought, this really fits these folks. So it's a word that I coined to describe public health professors and other health professionals who feel that our health is so completely at the mercy of social forces that there really is little people can do to safeguard their health, and accordingly that the effort of health professionals really should be to encompass social justice. And in fact, the former dean of the Harvard School of Public Health, and schools of public health in general, really are ground zero of this movement. Was quoted as saying, "A school of public health is like a school of justice." The American Public Health Association is quite politicized. They have lots of policy statements. Some of them make perfect sense. They talk about lead exposure and good policies for preventing that. But they also have policy statements on campaign finance reform and the war in Nicaragua and earned income tax credits. And this certainly is moving away from the fundamental mission of public health, which is developing the scientific and practical bases of disease and injury prevention.